It must be so weird for Nicolas Sarkozy, the guy who was once the most powerful man in France, to suddenly find himself living here. Or at least a room like this. He'll have a bed, a desk, a window with bars, a small fridge he can rent. This is solitary confinement, 23 hours a day. Figure about 100 square feet in all. If the former French president is willing to spend a few euros a month, he could also rent a small TV. He could stock his fridge from the canteen and cook on a tiny stove, do his dishes, shower, use the bathroom, even make phone calls to certain prearranged numbers. Which all seems to roughly match this 3D mock-up published by Le Parisien, which is a major French daily newspaper. All of which to say, this is what prison looks like when you're a former world leader in an isolation wing for his own protection against other inmates. But let's rewind. Sarkozy's last breaths of free air before submitting to solitary. The entire area near the prison cordoned off by police, Sarkozy walking hand in hand with his wife, going to prison for an as yet unclear amount of time and still presumed innocent. How does a former French president wind up behind bars under these circumstances? I'll explain.
This scanned document suggests the former Libyan leader, Muammar Gaddafi, bankrolled the Sarkozy campaign to the tune of $66 million.
Sarkozy angrily denied accusations on live TV that he received money from deposed Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi.
The central charge against Nicolas Sarkozy, the one that's landed him in prison, is the allegation that he conspired to accept millions of dollars from a Libyan dictator in a scheme to finance his presidential election campaign in 2007, a favor he would return by rehabilitating the image of Muammar Gaddafi and Libya on the world stage.
And so this is a really murky story of campaign financing, of dirty deeds and involvement with a pariah state. And it seems to really have been about trading influence for ideas of campaign funds off the books.
Nicolas Sarkozy
est élu nouveau président de la République.
Sarkozy did go on to win the presidential election in 2007, beginning his first and only 5-year term, as well as a fairly rocky relationship with a new friend. It began on a high. In 2007, Sarkozy would do exactly what prosecutors suggested his campaign promised he would do, which is to welcome Gaddafi into the Western fold. Or, as prosecutors would later put it, to create the circumstances for an act of corruption at the highest level.
Certainly Gaddafi is not going to be leaving here empty-handed. French military jets, even a contract to build a French nuclear reactor for electrical purposes in Libya.
Sarkozy and Gaddafi would sign deals worth billions of euros. France really leading the charge to help Libya reintegrate into the broader economic order.
So drew them in from the wilderness. And of course, it put him on the world stage. It meant that he was, pictured on the steps of the Elysee Palace, visited Versailles, he was treated to a state dinner, all of these things that become part of the pomp and ceremony of international diplomacy. That's a sort of laundering of the reputation.
But this partnership would not last. At the risk of oversimplifying here, because it was never going to be easy for Libya and the West to suddenly lock arms. If the high point of relations between France and Libya was 2007, the low point was just a few years later, in late 2010, early 2011, when Arab Spring pro-democracy protests swept the region.
Muammar Gaddafi, the leader who ruled Libya for 4 decades by crushing the opposition, could himself be crushed by a popular uprising.
In the eastern city of Benghazi, calls for Muammar Gaddafi to be brought to justice.
Perhaps seeing trouble ahead, Sarkozy would turn on Gaddafi, eventually becoming one of the first Western leaders to push effectively for Gaddafi's ouster in March 2011.
NATO airstrikes have struck the Libyan president's compound, reportedly killing 3 civilians and wounding dozens more.
President Nicolas Sarkozy spearheaded the West's military intervention during the conflict to oust Colonel Muammar Gaddafi.
This would cause Gaddafi and his Western relationships to tear at the seams.
Increasingly paranoid, increasingly convinced that in the wake of the Arab Spring, people were plotting against him, that he had not been given the deals or the treatment that he thought he deserved. And that's maybe one of the reasons we can look to this sort of settling of scores and unleashing all these old secrets from the past.
It was between this period of Western pressure on Libya and Gaddafi's ultimate capture and death at the hands of NATO-backed rebels in Libya, Gaddafi would turn on Sarkozy. It's thanks to us that he reached the presidency. Gaddafi would say in an interview, we provided him with the funds that allowed him to win. That was a big moment. So far as I can tell, the first major moment this idea would spread, that a foreign dictatorship had secretly bankrolled a French election. And going way back to 2005, 2006, when Sarkozy was merely a presidential hopeful.
Je crois que le rendez-vous de 2007, c'est pas simplement un rendez-vous de changement de génération, ça doit être un rendez-vous assez profond de changement de façon de faire de la politique.
According to the charges against him, which Sarkozy has denied since the start, it was during this period where Sarkozy's campaign really first became invested in a relationship with Muammar Gaddafi.
So there are a number of people that are tied up in this really quite complicated system of corruption. Some close confidants of Nicolas Sarkozy, some of whom have been imprisoned alongside him as part of the same trial.
I won't get overly bogged down here with names and dates, but over the last decade, there have been all kinds of sordid details dug up by journalists and investigators, some of which have been contested, mind you. But just to give you a sense of things, there have been reports of early meetings between members of Sarkozy's staff and Gaddafi's brother-in-law and head of military intelligence. At one dinner, a deal to lift an arrest warrant and push for closer diplomatic and economic ties between the two countries. At another meeting, handing over banking information to receive Libyan funds. Much later, reports of a diary belonging to Libya's late oil minister, with entries dating back to 2007 alleging millions of euros sent to the Sarkozy camp from Libyan dignitaries. A Lebanese-French businessman would then go on record claiming to have personally delivered suitcases with millions of euros of cash.
Une valise comme ça, ça s'ouvre comme ça s'ouvre et l'argent est dedans.
That businessman, by the way, became the key accuser in the case against Sarkozy, but he died just days before the judge would reach a verdict. Sarkozy has fairly consistently said he's an innocent man. He believes the allegations against him are in fact a revenge plot, retaliation for turning on Gaddafi and calling for his downfall. But last month, a court in Paris disagreed.
Former French President Nicolas Sarkozy has been sentenced to 5 years in prison.
A Paris court found him guilty of accepting campaign funds from the late Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi.
Which brings us back to two important questions that we raised at the start of all this. Why don't we know how long he'll be behind bars, and why is he, despite the guilty verdict, currently presumed innocent? Well, he was handed a 5-year sentence, but his lawyers have already filed for his early release, which French legal experts have suggested could happen within a month. Sarkozy has also appealed the guilty verdict, which, according to French law, snaps everything back to a presumption of innocence. It ordinarily effectively suspends the guilty verdict. So then, you might ask, why is he in prison at all? Well, the judge in this case said the facts were exceptionally serious and capable of undermining citizens' trust in public institutions, with Sarkozy having used his position to prepare an act of corruption at the highest level.
And so this is the first time that even though he said he's going to appeal, the judge also applied what is called in French an exécution provisoire, which means that the sentence will be carried even though an appeal is underway.
This is a serious moment, I think. But it's also something that I think should be a source of pride for French people, because it shows the wheels of justice working. It's not a sign that there are privileges or that anyone is above the law. This is a real sense that justice can reach out and touch even a former president.
And so that's how a former French president ends up presumed innocent, but in prison for an unknown period of time in a nearly unprecedented set of circumstances. A very influential man now locked in a very small room.